All right, well, welcome back to my garage. I've been wanting for a long time to do an episode on the bandsaw for a couple reasons. I have this bandsaw here that I restored a while back. It was actually made in 1952. It's a Delta Milwaukee, truly American made machine, and I had to do some work to it, but I got it back in working order. Bandsaws today pretty much work the same way, look the same as this one that was made back then, so I'm going to be able to show you a lot on this. Also, I taught woodshop for 30 years, and in that 30 years, I only had four, I guess you would call them memorable events in my shop. None of them were life-changing or that serious, but two of those four things happened on the bandsaw, and both times it happened because the person made the same mistake, and I'm going to show you what that mistake was during this episode, as well as just make something cool. Hi, my name is Bob, and I love my two-car garage. Alright, I took this apart so you can see what's going on inside. Took off the table, took off the top wheel cover and the bottom wheel cover. Bandsaw is called a bandsaw because it's one continuous band of blade that goes around these two wheels. This is a 14-inch bandsaw, which means it's 14 inches from there to there. You almost have 14 inches of throat right in here to work with. You're going to have about 6 inches or so of depth of cut possible. 14-inch bandsaw, it's a really good sized bandsaw for most of the stuff that you're going to do. Now you can put different blades on your bandsaw. Here's one that's all wound up and ready to spring open on me. And this is a 1/2-inch blade. If you're going to do real intricate cuts, like cut out little cartoons or something like that, then you're going to get a skinnier blade. You can get a 1/4-inch blade or even an 1/8-inch blade. It's going to allow you to make real tight cuts. If you're doing resawing of lumber or something like that, then you can get a wider blade, and so it'll go straighter for you. All right, I'm going to make some adjustments here, and when you make these adjustments, you have to do it pretty much in this order. If you do them out of order, then you're going to have to go back and start all over again. First thing you want to do when you put on a new bandsaw blade is you got to check for the bandsaw blade tension. And there are different ways to determine that. It doesn't have to be too tight. The most common mistake is to over tighten the bandsaw blade. And on the back there's a knob, and the knob has an indicator on it that shows you how much tension you're supposed to have on it for that particular width of blade. Now the reason I'm not showing that to you, because that little gauge on the back is pretty much always wrong, because it gets old, the springs don't always work the same, the length of the blade might be a little bit different, so you need to figure out a different way to get the right tension on your saw. The way that I'm going to use is I'm going to loosen it up, and then I'm just going to wiggle the blade back and forth, and I'm going to check for deflection in the blade. Should not deflect more than about 1/4 inch when I push on it sideways like this. Now there are more scientific ways to determine how tight this blade is going to be. If you really need it to be perfect, then you can actually put a gauge on this wheel and measure the tension on that blade, and it has to be a certain PSI. I think it's about 20,000 PSI, something like that. Another way is to actually turn the saw on and watch for it to wobble. And when it starts to wobble, then you just tighten it up a little turn, and that's all it needs. It doesn't have to be super tight. All right, once you have your tension set, then you need to adjust the tracking on your saw. Before you do that, make sure you back off the thrust bearing, and there's one on the top and there's one on the bottom. You don't want that bearing to be holding the blade in a position that's not really true, that's not going to maintain itself. So I'm going to spin I backed off those thrust bearings. I'm going to spin this wheel around, and I'm going to turn this little knob back here. And in my case, it's a little wing nut. And I want the back side of those teeth on my saw blade to be in the center of the tire. I don't want the blade to be in the center of the tire. I want the cutting part of the blade to be in the center of the tire. All right, now this little gizmo right here is really important. If you don't get this adjusted right, as soon as you turn on your saw, it's going to ruin your blade. And there's one on the top and there's one on the bottom. There's some guides that are on either side of the blade, and there's a thrust bearing back here as well. First thing I'm going to do is adjust my guides so that they are just behind the cutting edge of the blade, or the teeth of the blade. I'm going to put them about a 1/16 behind, and then on this particular saw there's a little place for me to lock it down. And the same thing's going to happen down below. I'm going to turn this little knob right here. I'm going to put those guides about a 1/16 of an inch behind the teeth. On the top side then, I'm going to adjust the thrust bearing. There's a knob back here, and I'm going to put it just behind. And then I'm going to lock it down. I'm going to spin my wheel around and make sure it doesn't move. Now it won't move now, but as soon as I start to cut some wood, it should start to spin. Now these little guides right here can also be adjusted, and if you read the manual, it'll just say they get it as close as possible to the blade. You don't want these little blocks to be rubbing against the blade all the time, or the blade's going to get hot and it's going to break before it's time. If you notice, I did all those adjustments with the table off. That was so that you could see what was going on, but it's also a good idea to do it that way all the time. Helps you to be more accurate. And it also gives you a chance to kind of clean things up, blow it off, do a little maintenance, a little lubrication, stuff like that. All right, and my Delta Milwaukee vintage bandsaw is all ready for cutting again. I want to make one more adjustment, and that's the angle on this table here. I'm going to just line it up initially with a tri-square here, and so I'm going to lay that on the table and line it up. Of course, you also got your little indicator down here that has degrees on it, but it's never perfect. I'm going to show you a perfect way to get this lined up. It's genius. Watch this. This is what you're going to do. You're going to take a 2x4 like this, and you're going to make a little cut. Like that. See that? Then you're going to flip it around the other way. And you're going to see what it does. It should fit exactly in that groove right there. It doesn't. So that means I need to make some adjustments. This is actually my 6th cut, but this time it's going to be perfect. Watch this. Flip it around the other side. Slides right in the groove. That means it's dead on. All right, before we actually get into cutting on this saw, which I know you want to do real quick, so we're going to get to it real fast, I want to tell you a couple of random things. First of all, when you do everything that we just did, when you're making the adjustments on your saw, make sure that it is unplugged, not just turned off, but unplugged. You don't want it accidentally coming on when you're in the middle of making those adjustments, and it always scares me just to know that it's a possibility. So make sure that your saw is unplugged. Number 2, it's a good idea to sand and wax down your table occasionally. Helps the work slide in and off through your table real well, and the easier you can work, the safer it is. Third thing is that these blades right here are actually kind of fun to work with. They remind me of a slinky. You can actually twist them like this, roll them up. This is where they usually come out of the package, and then you're going to put them away with a little piece of tape on it, or better yet, a little zip tie if you have one. Learning how to do that, twist it properly, is kind of makes you look like you know what you're doing. So I'm going to put a piece of tape on there. Along the same line, these blades can get inverted. They can get turned inside out, kind of like a sock. So if that happens, you're just going to take it and kind of flip it around, and that'll make it right, make it good to go. If it's wrong, when you get it on your bandsaw, the teeth are going to be pointing up instead of down, and it won't work that way. So make sure that your blade teeth are pointing down. Also, did I mention that this saw was made in 1952 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin? Just want to make sure you didn't miss that one. I know I said it before, but I think it's really cool. It's kind of like owning a 57 Chevy or something. Okay, last thing before we get into the cutting. I told you that I was going to tell you what happened to those people in my shop that they cut themselves. I told you that they broke a rule, or they didn't do something on their bandsaw, and that's why they cut themselves. And it's a really big deal. I think it's the most important safety rule of all, so I want to make a big deal out of it. And that safety rule is what we're going to talk about in the first part of the next video, because this is getting way too long. Don't forget to like, subscribe, make a comment. Remember, in all labor there is profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. See you in part 2.